thanks for joining us again, Lord Hague.
Great pleasure.
Real pleasure to sit down with you. It's been a while since we last spoke, around the time of the election. How do you reflect on these sort of last few months, that period as well, the sort of really odd process
of the election of the Chancellor?
The election of the Chancellor.
Well, it is a unique process. It seemed to go on a long time to the participants, longer than electing the President of the United States.
Quite
possibly a bit more complicated than electing the President of the United States.
Also quite complicated.
But I think much less rancor or disagreement than electing the President of the United States. So I enjoyed it, actually. I really enjoyed the process, and it was a good thing that it was a long one because, as you know, it was because you interviewed me and other candidates, it meant that candidates came back to Oxford, spent time here, spoke to student societies, made visits, thought about the place. So actually that was a really good process, I think, and my other reflection on it would be that it was good-natured, actually. Since then, of course, I ended up winning it, but there were very worthy competitors. Yeah. Nearly all of whom I've seen since then, among those who were in the final round, and we've all had a good chat, and they all remain very committed to doing things for Oxford in the future. I had an excellent chat with Elish Angelini a couple of weeks ago, and she introduced me to the fellows in St Hugh's. So it's, in that sense, it's entirely different from political election. Some of the elections going on in the world, and that is also a good reflection on Oxford and the process.
One of your competitors, of course, now in Washington, wouldn't rather be there.
Yeah, I definitely would not rather be there. No, I think I think he's ended up with a much harder job. I wish him well. In that it's really important for the country that he does well and that goes well. And he's got a lot of experience to put into that job. But no, I really would not swap with him. I think that it's the most difficult time in decades to be the ambassador to the United States. So all credit to him for taking that on.
So you've got a decade to do this job. It's a long time. If you had to identify sort of a couple of things that you really wanted to achieve in that time, what would they be?
So remember, chancellors don't actually run the university. They 600 years ago had the very good idea of making sure there was a vice-chancellor to do that, and we've got a great vice-chancellor who's doing that. There are some clear responsibilities, though, for a chancellor, and looking after benefactors to the university is an important part of that. There is the Chancellor's Court of Benefactors, the people who have given the most to the university, and we need a lot more of those. We need their generosity over the next decade in a very big way. I think some of our fundraising plans over the coming years will be the most ambitious ever for the university, and we need that for all sorts of things, for new updated science facilities, for graduate scholarships to improve access for graduate students in particular, and to support access for students across the board. So I think that's a big part. I would like to say in 10 years' time that I've materially helped to boost the endowment and the way the university benefits from philanthropy.
Do you think that's the biggest challenge for Oxford now? I mean, what would you identify as the main challenge for Oxford going forward?
Well, what I'm talking about there is one of the biggest challenges for the Chancellor, what the Chancellor can make a difference to. Yeah. But I think for Oxford and for all universities, the next decade this is not a problem specific to universities, but universities will really be in the fulcrum of it. Is that this is a decade of exceptional change that is coming up, of the fastest ever technological and scientific change. That will change education in many ways that we can't anticipate. But staying at the cutting edge of everything, staying the number one university in the world in computer science, and making sure that in a world where things are changing so rapidly that we, the number one university in the world in most rankings, don't fall behind. That is bound to be an enormous challenge when so much will be in a state of flux, when we're looking at a world in a state of economic and social and political upheaval in many ways that will only intensify. So how to get through that successfully is really one of the biggest challenges for Oxford.
What role do you think Oxford can play in that sort of revolution? There's a huge focus on university spin-out companies at the moment. The government's talking a lot about universities as engines for growth and all of these different things that can come out of a university. Do you think Oxford itself can play a key role in the UK's development of artificial intelligence?
I think what happens in Oxford is critical to the success of the UK. I will say in my speech that it is in the critical national interest of the United Kingdom to invest in Oxford and our other leading universities across the UK. And the good news is that the government has really noticed this in the last few months. As you know, Rachel Reeves was in Oxfordshire making a speech a few weeks ago and announced the government's support for a whole arc of innovation between Oxford and Cambridge, to support the railway to Cambridge, to set up an Oxford Growth Commission. So I think the government have got that point, provided they follow through. And that's where the Chancellor again has a job as a public figure, as somebody who's had a lifetime in politics. It is part of my job in representing the university to urge them on to really deliver on those things, because it is one thing to give a speech about those things; it's another thing then to find the money to do it. So that's a very big part of it, but it's also making sure that universities are providing the intellectual input and capital about what this new age really is going to mean, because it's not just about science and tech. It will change the way culture is developed and transmitted. It will change our ethics. It will affect our politics. It will change the economics of the country. Well, where do you bring that together most effectively? You do it in the thinking of a great university.
Do you see a tension between using universities as an engine for growth, as it were, and investing in them and their research, and the sort of day-to-day focus of teaching undergraduates in the best way possible? So I think a lot of students maybe see billions of pounds and these great, we're going to generate £78 billion for the UK economy in the Oxcam arc, but at the end of the day they might feel that their undergraduate teaching is falling behind. How do you balance those two things?
Well, this is a good question. You have to balance those two things, and the reason Oxford is such a preeminent university in the world is because we do both of those things. We are so high in those world rankings because this is such a great centre of research and of teaching. Now, remember that if you are a great centre of those spin-outs, of that research, of the extraordinary medical advances that are taking place, for instance, in Oxford, that means you are then attracting the scientists, the expertise, from all over the world that wants to be here, and that definitely spills over then into the excellent quality of teaching. But that teaching side should never be neglected. So I think the Vice Chancellor and all her colleagues are very, very conscious of that.
Do you think Oxford in recent times has sort of fallen into a pattern maybe of not being radical enough, not embracing new opportunities enough? Obviously it's got so much history. Do you think sometimes there's maybe a temptation to not innovate in certain areas? I mean, obviously there's lots of new technologies and research, but just on basic things with regards to teaching.
Well, I haven't come here to tell everybody they've been doing it all wrong
No, quite.
the last few years, because of course Oxford's continued to do very, very well.
But nobody's doing everything perfect either at the same time.
No, and also we do things in so many different ways. This is not, the university is an institution, but it's a very complex organism, isn't it? With more than 40 colleges and halls and more than 40 institutes and dozens of different departments. If you add in all the sub-departments, you come to about 350 departments and sub-departments. So will they all be doing everything perfectly? Well, no, but they won't all do all the wrong thing at the same time either. And of course, teaching and tuition does develop, and it will change a lot, I think, with the arrival of AI on the scene. Again, really hard to forecast exactly how that will change. But this is bound to change teaching and education pretty radically, even in great universities as well as in every school.
What kind of concrete ways do you think it will change higher education in general? Because I think it's another one of those things, we hear a lot about it, and obviously the nature of it is very hard to predict. But can you think of some ways in which you think artificial intelligence and the technologies that stem from it will make concrete differences to people's education?
Well, I think it will be, at the moment, it's most effective where people use it as a co-intelligence rather than a separate resource. So it seems that the people who are going to benefit most successfully from it will be those really getting used to using it on an hourly basis throughout their working day. And one of the things we don't know yet is it going to be an equalizer? Is it, when used in that way, going to be something that brings up to a higher level the people who are not performing so well? Or is it that the high performers have an even bigger advantage? And so one of the issues in education will be making sure that it is more of an equalizer, that it actually raises the standards of people overall. But I don't ask me to predict, what it means in terms of actually what you're doing, because the technology is changing so extraordinarily rapidly. There are now many leading figures in AI who say that we're only a few years from AGI. They disagree a lot, and some would say 2 years, and some would say no, that's still 10 years.
Some will say we already have it at the moment.
But if it's somewhere between 2 and 10 years, well, that's within the time that I've signed up to be Chancellor, there will be an artificial general intelligence at large in the world. And I don't think any of us know the consequences of that. But that is bound to, you're bound to see, for instance, many people receiving their education from some form of that.
And policy-wise, how do universities adapt to that? Because at the moment there are very strict policies on the use of artificial intelligence in your education, if it shows up anywhere in your work, because you can't actually prove if it's in any work, if people suspect that you've been using it in certain ways. How much of a challenge is that, and how should universities in general be adapting to that going forward?
It is again, it's hard to predict. No one can predict how that will develop. It is a challenge for universities, though, to make sure that the experience of being at university is still is an utterly human experience. That people are able to use developments in AI as that co-intelligence, but that when you come to Oxford, there are these great strengths of personal tuition, of a collegiate community, of great opportunities to take part in sports and in music, which are human things, where we are spending time with each other rather than staring into our smartphones. And so I think universities will have to work even harder to make sure that is the case, that people are having a fantastic human experience. Because the dark side of this new age of change is anxiety and loneliness, and people becoming excessively dependent on their relationship with machines rather than with other human beings.
I'm going to sort of shift now back to access, because it's something that you've spoken about before, access to Oxford for people from all backgrounds and state school backgrounds especially. I think it's really interesting that for a long time there was a massive progressive increase of state school students coming to Oxford. But since 2020 that's gone down every year, marginally, but still gone down. Why do you think that might be, and how important is it that Oxford sort of reverses that trend and keeps, maintaining that pace of increase?
Well, it's again, I stress and answer all that. It's not me that
absolutely.
I'm not running the admissions
throwing
process.
Ideas about.
And but clearly there has been some effect, and I've always been, as you know, and we've discussed it before, huge enthusiast for raising that state school percent. I was part of it myself. Absolutely. Nearly 50 years ago, the percentage was quite a lot lower. So that's been a good achievement to raise it. It's not good that it's slipped back as you say, in recent years. So I think it will be important to reverse that without thinking there is a perfect number.
Of course, yeah.
I suspect that COVID has been part of the answer. Not that there has been some mistake made in Oxford, but I think that some people were affected more than others by the loss of education in schools, by the lockdowns in schools, and so that will have had some impact, possibly greater impact on education in state schools than in private schools. So that is one theory. So I don't think we should obsess about small changes, but it is really important to keep up the momentum on this of broadening access. I think that's strongly in the mind of all the colleagues running these things.
Do you think the language of politicians around this helps? We sort of touched on this last time I spoke to you about this idea of Mickey Mouse degrees, and all of a sudden it's quite trendy to say that going to university isn't that helpful. You've got Kemi Badenoch now, leader of the opposition, says too many people are going to universities. I think she said yesterday, a country cannot be successful if its intellectual elite don't believe in it, and this means dealing with the poisoning of minds that is taking place in our higher education system. I mean, that language is really extreme from a lot, and it's not just from her, it's from all different parts of government. Do you think it's important that people start talking positively again about university?
It is very important, and again, I think that's part of my role to do that. So when you add up all the roles the Chancellor does have, it adds up to quite a bit.
For 10 years as well.
Yes, so that is part of my role, and I don't agree that too many people are going to university. I think, again, the way the world is changing, highly successful countries will end up with a higher proportion of their young people going to university. They may not all be studying the same things as today. That will need a new approaches to funding, long-term agreements on how higher education is going to be funded in the long term. But this is, in this age of AI and technological change, having highly skilled humans is going to be more important than ever, and being a country that attracts them from abroad as well as grows them domestically is going to be more important than ever. So I think you're right, it's a good question. It shows we do have some work to do in improving the image of higher education, which can be seen in all political parties as something that just takes up money. Whereas in fact, as we were discussing earlier, probably the biggest leverage you get in growing the economy is investing in good higher education.
I wanted to start off by asking about redundancies. So we've seen a lot in the news in the last few weeks that Cardiff have cut 400 jobs, and it's been forecasted that there'll be 10,000 imminent job losses across the sector. Now, Oxford alone saw over 500 redundancies last year. How can that be productive for students and academics? And importantly, how can universities combat this deficit?
Well, it's not good for students or for the country for higher education to be parts of higher education to be in a state of crisis. I think I just have to preface, though, saying more about that by saying there will always be change in higher education. There will always be some institutions doing better than others. There will always be some that are run better than others. There will always be some with different funding arrangements from others in different parts of the United Kingdom. So you're bound to see occasionally some places close, some places have redundancies and so on. But there clearly is a major problem of the funding of higher education in the UK. Now, I think that there's some recognition of that in the Labour government, because they are allowing student fees to go up with inflation. They've also, at the same time, though, managed to take nearly all that money away from universities by increasing employers' national insurance contributions. But there is a recognition that there is a problem. I don't see a solution to the problem in the UK without some greater public funding of higher education. And I think, as I was just discussing with Oliver, a highly successful economy in the future is going to have more higher education, not less. So on that long list of items that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has that actually need more money, the higher education sector is unfortunately one of them.
Great. And where do you kind of envision universities, say, in 5 years? What would be an ideal position for universities like Liverpool and Edge Hill that have recently cut staff, that maybe aren't as prestigious as Oxford and Cambridge, but are still in quite dire financial positions?
Well, I can't comment on individual institutions, but we need that great spread of institutions, and we all have an interest. In Oxford, we may be the oldest university, and that have more resources than other universities, and we have by far the highest research income of any university. But it is in our interest for there to be a healthy, entire higher education sector in the UK. Partnerships as part of that are part of that. For instance, Oxford is doing an increasing amount of work with Birmingham, as well as with all the great potential to work with Cambridge. So that great spread of universities working together, I think, should be part of that vision. But really, what we should be looking for, to answer your question, in 5 years' time, is more stability of funding over the longer term. Now, if you look at Australia, there's been some success in doing that. They're still fleshing out the details, but they have put together a longer-term compact, looking a couple of decades ahead, of what the government is expecting of universities in the next 20 years and what the universities can expect from the government. I don't know if we can achieve that in this country, but it is the sort of thing I would strongly encourage and will encourage while I'm in this role.
Great. So you mentioned the tuition fee increase in line with inflation, and maintenance loans have obviously risen a small amount, but not considerably. How do we make university funding sustainable, obviously both for the university itself and for students who are dissatisfied with the amount they're spending on their education and what they're actually getting from it?
Well, we can try to enlarge the resources available, and that is at least something in Oxford that we can do. That's one of the reasons I stood for the position as Chancellor, is that I've been involved in that in the past in Oxford, and starting the first campaign for Oxford in the late 1980s. And we will be doing a lot more of that over the coming years, including to support access. So I think it's fantastic what's been achieved in the last couple of decades when we think about things like Crank Start scholarships. We're going to need more of that sort of thing to build further on that over the next few years, because the financial pressures on students will not go away. So that is part of my job, really, to support those efforts. I will be spending a lot of my time fundraising in one way or another.
Yeah. So in terms of international students, we've spoken a lot about domestic students. The government's now finalising its education strategy to replace the 2019 plan, which aimed for 600,000 overseas students by 2030. Do you support aiming for a more ambitious target that some people are suggesting, and would you be willing to put a number on that?
I'm not going to put a number on that, no. And I don't think Oxford can put a number on that itself. The government can set out its approach to that. I do think that our approach in the United Kingdom, though, should be accommodating to large numbers of overseas students who are buying an important service in which the United Kingdom excels. We are a superpower, really, in higher education, with many of the top universities of the world. Policies on this have run into difficulty, including in the last government, because of immigration rules. The vast majority of overseas students are not staying as permanent migrants in the United Kingdom. The people of the country are all around the country who are very concerned about migration for perfectly legitimate reasons. For them, it's not the students really that they are worrying about. I'd love to find a way of counting them differently from the rest of the immigration numbers, because it really is a different thing, and I can see all the statistical problems of doing that. So I just hope that we have the good sense to see this as a different issue from wide-scale, permanent immigration.
And do you think that obviously the United Kingdom has an appeal for education? However, we've seen a 17% decrease in applications from overseas since 2023. Why do you think that is, and what can the Labour government do to attract new talent to the UK?
Well, that will be predominantly because it's become so much harder to bring dependents in at the same time. So it's not surprising that has reduced the total number of applications. I don't see any sign of the Labour government reversing that because of the immigration issue. And you can see that, of course, that I was just saying how students coming to use the great service of British higher education is different from general immigration. But you can also see that if they bring large numbers of dependents with them, it is adding to immigration overall. So governments are in a difficult spot on that. I don't see the Labour government changing those rules. What can they do to make sure that it is attractive? Well, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about making sure the whole higher education sector is a success. And what would make Oxford even more attractive in the future, really go ahead with all the commitments on a Silicon Valley, or whatever we want to call it, of Oxford and Cambridge. Get that railway built to Cambridge so that people know that they already know if they go to Oxford or Cambridge, they're going to two of the top universities in the world. But if that is one of the world's major centers of innovation and thinking, when you put the whole area together, well, that is even more attractive to come and be part of that. So a lot of this is not just about changing the rules. It is about making sure we remain in Oxford and in British higher education #1 in the world.
Yeah. So obviously the Oxcam arc is a very attractive idea, linking Oxford and Cambridge for growth and scientific research. Now, subjects like music, modern languages, and even nursing have been cut in universities like Cardiff. Do you think that the arts are still important to preserve, and how can we balance the financial need for growth with preserving traditional educational fields?
They are absolutely critically important because all of those new technologies are going to need humanities to go with them. And look at some of the brilliant things that are happening in Oxford. There's the well-publicized news about the scrolls, from Roman to the Vesuvius scrolls from Herculaneum, which it's now becoming possible to decipher those. Well, actually, that is art and science working together. And so there will be many more applications of technology that bring exciting advances outside the scientific area, and vice versa. And there is this, as you know, I was talking with Oliver a few moments ago about the importance of retaining our essential humanity, really, because the dark side of technological change is people spending less time just in the glorious pursuit of being human. And going out less, having fewer friends, being addicted to that screen. Music and sport and so many other great human activities are an essential antidote to that. So they don't get any less important in an age of rapid scientific change.
Great. So you spoke to Oliver about access briefly and access to higher education. So do you think universities across the country do enough to broaden their appeal to people from different backgrounds, different areas of the country? And how could they do better?
They do a lot. Again, it's hard for me to speak about universities in general because I'm obviously very focused on Oxford compared to, and then of course I think about it I immediately compare it to when I was an undergraduate here. Well, the efforts are vastly greater today to improve access. and just meeting students in colleges today and seeing the efforts that the colleges go to improve access is a completely different world. And now that doesn't mean it's perfect, it's just that it's a lot better than 50 years ago. But I think in Oxford we do a pretty good job of doing that, and of course there are the number of applications for places at Oxford is vastly greater than the number of places available. The diversity of students in every way is much greater than it was before, than it was even 10 years ago. So I think everybody in Oxford is doing pretty well, but we will have to keep up the efforts as society changes over the coming years.
Great. And kind of looking to the US, so when we spoke back in October, you told me that you have deep connections in government, philanthropy and business in America. Now, there are concerns that the US-UK special relationship with research and partnerships could be caught up in Trump's crackdown on DEI, a US embassy-funded grant scheme that's run jointly with the UK. Has recently been asked to erase any mention of diversity from its awarding criteria. And research and innovation funded around 3,000 awards in the 8 years up to 2023 with the US. Now, do you envision that relationship with research in the US to become strained because of Trump's administration, and how would you go about dealing with that?
Well, I can see how it could for the reasons that you give. The answer to that really is to ensure the excellence of that research so that there's a really compelling case across the Atlantic to continue those partnerships. And we were talking earlier about my former opponent for the job of Chancellor, Peter Mandelson, being the ambassador to the United States. Really, it's another task on his checklist. To try to make sure, I'll make sure he's got plenty of things to do on behalf of Oxford. He's been so keen to support Oxford, is to make sure that that they're conscious that they shouldn't be giving up quality in the name of ideological or cultural differences, whichever way you see them from either side of the Atlantic. I think a lot of universities will be working very hard to keep up the cooperation. And a lot of those partnerships will endure beyond any single term of a president in the United States or any single government in the UK. So you're right to start to worry about that, I think. But the connections between the US and the UK in politics, in government, in defence, in intelligence, in business remain extremely strong, and so I think that leads to a pretty positive atmosphere in cooperation in research and education as well.
Great. And the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act has been committed to by the government very recently. Does the Act have your full support, and how much do you think it will really matter day to day at universities?
It does have my full support, yes. I said while standing for this position that they should activate that, and they did. I don't know whether that was because Oxford spoke, but certainly they saw the arc. They were coming under a lot of pressure to do so. And so I'm pleased that they've done that. I think it helps to reinforce our strong belief, which is very strong from most people in Oxford, of freedom of speech within the law, and academic freedom as well, to know that there is a backstop for that, to know that the law reinforces that, I think is important. It may not change what 95% of people say 95% of the time, but it means there is really a strong defense of freedom of speech and academic freedom if that becomes necessary. So I think they've done the right thing there. I'm very pleased the government has listened to many of us who have spoken about this.
And part of the Act prohibits universities from using non-disclosure agreements in cases of harassment and misconduct. Now, Oxford's been criticised in the past for its use of NDAs. Do you think it's appropriate that Oxford has used them and that other universities have used them in the past?
Well, I support the Act, so I think this is a good provision in the Act, and I'm not going. I don't know all the circumstances where these things have been used in the past, but they're not. It's not something that I would at all encourage or approve of. So, hopefully, this Act is going to settle that once and for all.
And do you think it's comprehensive in its kind of ability to allow any member of the university to speak freely on whatever issue they may have? Do you think it goes far enough?
I think it goes far enough. The government, in their commitment to enact it, to bring it into force, the government has missed out some of its provisions and are not doing it entirely, for instance, in relation to student unions. And they're not bringing the provisions regarding tort, so that it is a slight weakening of the Act. But nevertheless, it's a big step forward. I think we'll have to see how that works in practice before advocating further changes. So, yes, I think this is something to be welcomed. There's cross-party agreement. There's strong agreement across leading universities that this is a good idea. So let's see how that works for the next few years, and let's make the most of freedom of speech in Oxford, which takes so many different forms. I think that the Sheldonian series that has been introduced is a really good idea to show that in Oxford there is a spirit of open inquiry that is inclusive. It's not just about formal debates, and that freedom of speech within the law is welcomed, that we don't all expect to agree on every single thing. That's the right atmosphere. So, and again, this is adding endlessly in this interview to all the things the Chancellor is going to do. Taking part in that and encouraging that is obviously part of my role.
So freedom of speech, especially on areas of the Middle East, it's been quite a big issue for universities across the world, really. I wondered, what's your views on what is appropriate to say and not to say, and do you have any red lines there?
Well, the debate and argument should always be respectful. There's bound to be really fierce differences that become emotional on subjects like that, on both sides of the argument. The important thing is to hear both sides of the argument and to respect that people may have a difference of view. So yeah, let's have vigorous debates about these things, but in a atmosphere of consideration for other people, where you do listen to the other side of the argument, where there's no shouting down of the other side of the argument. The whole purpose of debate is to see if we might be wrong, to hear the other side of the argument. So I think that it's important that tone is maintained. Doesn't mean we will disagree any less on something like the Gaza war or the Ukraine war, whatever it may be. It doesn't mean we'll disagree any less, but we should be able to do so respectfully. That is really my red line in those things. Respect other people's opinions and get used to listening to opinions that are different from your own, because we're entering an age where that will happen more and more. There's absolutely no point thinking that you can leave Oxford and go out into a world where everybody's going to agree with you. So let's get used to the idea. We're always going to have to argue, but we're always going to have to listen to the other side of the argument. And
finally, there's been protests this term in Oxford, so you'll see the police abseiling down the Radcliffe camera, and just this week, gender-critical speakers at colleges, such as Helen Joyce, have been protested. Do you have a message for these protesters at the university?
Well, it's really the one that I was talking about. Respect that people do have different points of view, and it's important to listen to those things. And yes, there was what happened at the Radcliffe camera, although from what I know, very few students were involved in that. Yeah. So sometimes there are people who come from outside Oxford who are trying to use Oxford in one way or another to get publicity. I think I would just stress that, again, listen to other points of view. Don't imagine that you can cancel the rest of the world. You do have to be able to get used to listening to different arguments. So yeah, there's again very strong difference of view on gender matters, but planned meetings, as I understand it, have gone ahead, and it's important that all those arguments continue without being stopped by protests.
That's all the questions I have, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.